Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at a single, just profoundly shocking event from modern South Korean history.
Yeah, it's a case that became this really grotesque symbol of a much wider national trauma.
We're diving into the 1998 Bucheon video store murder, but you probably know it by its more infamous name, the mummy tape mystery.
And that name, it comes from the central fact of the case, which is just as bizarre and horrifying as it sounds.
It really is. The victim, a man named Mr. Sun, who owned the video shop, was found completely immobilized.
Wow.
He had been encased, literally from head to toe, in clear packing tape.
Wrapped and wrapped and wrapped.
Yeah, until he looked like this macabre, modern mummy.
Perfectly preserved in plastic. It's an image you just can't shake.
And the timing here is everything. This happened on March 2nd, 1998. It was the year of the tiger, but more importantly...
Far more importantly, it was the absolute bottom, the lowest point of what South Koreans call the IMF era.
And that context, as we're going to see, is absolutely crucial.
It is. When you look at all the source material, the analysis, the consensus is really clear. You can't look at this as just some isolated random act of madness.
Right. It wasn't in a vacuum.
Not at all. This crime is a direct reflection of the zeitgeist, the mood, the spirit of a society that was just violently fracturing under this catastrophic economic pressure.
And that mood was what?
Panic. Panic, shame, total desperation. So our mission in this deep dive is to get past those sensational headlines.
Okay.
We need to analyze this through really three different lenses. First, you have to get the socioeconomic pressure cooker of that IMF crisis.
The big picture.
The big picture. Then second, we'll get into the forensic details, the almost theatrical nature of the crime scene itself.
The ritual of it all.
The ritual, exactly. And then finally, we have to wrestle with this huge psychiatric and legal question mark around the suspect, Mr. Kim, and his really elaborate shadow defense.
Okay, so let's unpack all of that. We're not just reconstructing a murder here. We're trying to understand how the collapse of an entire country's economy could lead to the collapse of one person's mind.
Right.
All right, so the IMF crisis, for many people, that's just a kind of historical footnote. But for South Koreans who lived through it, it was this immense collective trauma.
Oh, absolutely.
So we need to start there. What was the foundation of this crisis? What happened?
Well, at its core, it was a classic liquidity crisis. A lot of Asian economies were going through it, but the effect on the national psyche in Korea was anything but classic.
Okay.
In December 1997, South Korea was staring down the barrel of national bankruptcy. Literally, the country was about to go broke.
So they had no choice.
They had no choice but to go, cap in hand, to the International Monetary Fund and accept a bailout package.
And this was a huge one, right?
Record-breaking. At the time, it was the largest financial rescue package the IMF had ever put together, $58.5 billion.
Wow.
And you have to understand, the nation saw itself as this global success story. The Han River miracle.
Right. From post-war poverty to an economic powerhouse in a generation.
And then, overnight, they were begging for help. That feeling of national humiliation. It was just immense. You can't overstate it.
And of course, that money came with some very, very painful strings attached.
Oh, yes. The conditionalities, the rules the IMF imposed, that's what really tore the social structure apart.
What kind of rules are we talking about?
Aggressive textbook structural adjustments. The IMF demanded forced privatization of state assets, deregulation of markets, and a brutal singular focus on shedding corporate debt.
And shedding debt really just means shedding people.
It means shedding labor immediately. This didn't just change corporate balance sheets. It ripped up the social contract that had defined Korean life for decades.
Let's talk about that social contract. It was built around the big conglomerates, the K-balls, right?
Yeah, Samsung, Hyundai, LG. These massive family-owned firms that dominated everything.
Yeah.
The system was, for lack of a better word, paternalistic.
How so?
Well, if you were a man and you got a job at a big K-ball, you were basically set for life. You were joining a kind of corporate family.
The promise of lifetime employment.
That was the implicit promise, yes. You give them your loyalty, your hard work, and in return, they guarantee you a secure future. For you, for your family, your job title was your identity.
It was your entire social standing.
Exactly. The whole system was built on that idea. So when the IMF forced these companies to restructure and lay off huge numbers of workers...
They called it honorary retirement, which sounds so...
It's a horrible euphemism. But when they did that, that promise just died. overnight. And the social safety net, which was already pretty weak, it was just gone.
And the source material really emphasizes the psychological damage this did, particularly within a Confucian framework. Losing your job wasn't just a financial problem.
No, it was a complete negation of identity. In a society influenced by Confucian values, a man's worth, his entire identity, is tied up in his role as the provider.
The head of the household.
The one who maintains the family's honor. So to be laid off publicly as part of this national failure, it wasn't just unemployment. It was a deep public shaming.
And that created this nationwide sense of despair.
A collective sense of 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄, which is a really profound Korean word for hopelessness, a feeling that the country itself had failed.
And you see that hopelessness reflected in the raw economic numbers. The speed of the collapse is just, it's breathtaking.
It's a shockwave. Look at 1998, the peak of the crisis. GDP growth had been a healthy, plus 7% just 2 years earlier.
And in 98,
it cratered to minus 5.1%.
That's a massive swing.
That's a violent level of economic contraction. It meant businesses failing everywhere, unemployment skyrocketing, and it hit the people with the most debt the hardest. Young workers, people in their 20s and 30s.
I remember reading about the public response, that famous gold collection movement. Does that sort of show the intensity of this national feeling?
It's the perfect illustration of that shared trauma. Millions of ordinary people, responding to this national shame, willingly donated their own personal gold.
Like their wedding rings.
Wedding rings, family heirlooms, baby's first birthday rings. Literal gold. They brought it to collection points to be melted down to help pay off the IMF loan.
And this wasn't something the government ordered them to do?
No, it was spontaneous. A patriotic act driven by this desperate need to reclaim national dignity. It shows you the level of pressure every single person was under in early '98.
So at the ground level, all this pressure translates into one thing: debt.
Unmanageable debt. And this is where the suspect, Mr. Kim, comes in. He was already struggling with personal debt. But here's the absolute killer detail tied to the IMF rules.
The interest rates.
The interest rates. The IMF demanded tight monetary policy to stabilize the currency, so interest rates just exploded. They went from around 12%.
Which is already high.
To nearly 30%.
So your debt payments basically tripled overnight.
Exactly. Any debt that was maybe manageable before suddenly becomes a black hole you can never climb out of. The walls are closing in.
And this is the environment that leads to so-called survival crimes.
Desperate acts out of pure financial terror. But this case, the Bucheon case, it wasn't just a random robbery for cash.
No, it was deeply personal. It was fueled by this interpersonal debt between two people who knew each other.
And that's where the shame becomes so toxic. In this environment, borrowing from a friend, like Mr. Kim did from the victim, Mr. Sun, was common. But those relationships soured.
Because they become all about power.
Completely. The creditor, Mr. Sun, holds all the power. The debtor, Mr. Kim, is crushed by this unbearable weight of shame and resentment.
And that's the friction point. The shame of the debtor clashing with the, maybe the perceived arrogance of the creditor.
Or even just the simple demand for repayment. The IMF crisis just stripped away all the polite surfaces of society and exposed those raw nerves of financial dependency.
And that kind of personal slight, that ego wound from someone who has power over you.
That's so often the specific trigger for this kind of disproportionate, violent rage in these high-stress situations. The pressure wasn't just economic, it was existential. It was an attack on his very identity.
Okay, let's pivot now to the location itself. The video Diogeum. The video rental shop. This isn't just a random backdrop.
No, not at all. It's a really specific and culturally significant place for 1990s South Korea.
You have to remember, this is before high-speed internet, before streaming.
Right, so video shops were everything. They were everywhere. They were the main source of entertainment, of cultural life for the average family.
I think one of the sources mentioned that by 1993, the video rental market was actually bigger than the movie theater box office.
It was, which tells you how central these places were. And the physical space itself is key.
They were usually pretty small, right?
Very small. Often cramped, windowless, just these little bunkers with shelves crammed floor to ceiling with VHS tapes. They were like these hermetically sealed worlds, a refuge from the economic chaos outside.
And that tight enclosed space really defined the dynamic between the two men.
Oh, absolutely. For Mr. Sun, the owner, the victim, this little shop was his fortress.
His symbol of stability.
Exactly. His little island of success and survival while the world was falling apart. But for Mr. Kim, the suspect, It was more complicated.
It was a familiar place for him.
Yeah, he was a regular customer. It was probably a place of escape for him, too.
Yeah.
But every time he walked in there, he was physically inside the space that represented the power imbalance.
He was reminded of the owner's success and his own failure.
Right. The hierarchy of debt was just baked into the physical layout of the room.
So the environment didn't just contain the crime. It feels like it almost enabled it. It provided the tools and the narrative.
That's a great way to put it. The materiality of the scene is just so critical here. Let's look at two things the store provided. The tapes on the shelves and the packing tape itself.
Okay, so the VHS tape.
Thousands of them.
Yeah.
Thousands of stories. Horror movies, action movies, violent dramas. Kim, who's already under this immense psychological
So
stress.
it's just marinating in this environment of fictional violence.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And this directly supports his later defense, his claim that he thought he was in a movie scenario.
The line between real and fictional violence starts to get very blurry for him.
Extremely porous, especially in his distressed state.
And then there's the star prop, the item that gives the whole case its name, the packing tape.
Yes. And the crucial forensic detail here is how mundane it was. This wasn't some special item he brought with him to commit a crime.
It was just there.
It was just there in huge quantities. Video stores used a ton of this stuff.
For what?
For everything. Bundling up tapes for a weekend in the rental, repairing the plastic cases when they cracked, putting up posters. It was a tool of the trade.
So the fact that the murder weapon or the binding material was already on site.
It strongly suggests the crime was an escalation. A sudden burst of violence within a familiar place, not a premeditated ambush where he brought his own tools.
The tools of the business became the instruments of this bizarre ritual.
Exactly. So you have this one little room that is simultaneously the source of the economic pressure and the psychological stage. It offered both the means for the murder and the narrative for the defense.
So let's try to reconstruct the events of that night. It starts as just a social visit, two acquaintances. What was the spark?
Well, based on the investigation and Kim's own statements, it's pretty clear the conversation eventually turned to money.
Which, in that environment, was probably inevitable.
Almost certainly. For Mr. Sun, the owner, asking for his money back was a survival issue. For Mr. Kim, being asked for it was the final humiliation.
Right.
So the leading hypothesis is that Mr. Sun, probably fed up, made some kind of harsh or insulting remark about Kim's debt, or maybe his lack of prospects.
Just a casual cutting remark.
But for Kim, in his fragile state, already feeling like a total failure, that would have been the trigger, the narcissistic injury, as psychologists call it. And it unleashed this completely disproportionate rage.
So the initial violence happens. Mr. Sun is either killed or incapacitated. But that's not where it ends. That's where the really strange part begins.
That's where the staging starts. And he spends a lot of time on this. The timeline is tight. The homicide happens around 3:00 a.m., and he sets the fire at 3:50 a.m.
So in less than an hour.
In that 50-minute window, he performs this incredibly methodical, elaborate ritual of binding the body.
The overwrapping.
The overwrapping, yes. It's a total encasement, layer after layer after layer of tape, over the face, the limbs, the torso, until the man, Mr. Sun, is just gone, replaced by this static, plastic-wrapped figure.
It goes so far beyond just restraining someone. What's the psychological meaning behind that level of detail?
Well, forensic analysis points to two main psychological functions here, and they're both about dissociation and control.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is depersonalization. Kim knew his victim. This wasn't a stranger. He had just committed this profound act of violent betrayal against an acquaintance.
An acquaintance who represented his own failure.
Exactly. So to cope with the guilt, the horror of what he'd done, he had to erase the victim's identity. By wrapping the face, wrapping the body, he turned Mr. Sun from a person
Into an object.
into a thing, a prop, a mummy. It allowed him to psychologically distance himself from the act. It's not a person anymore.
Okay, so depersonalization. And the second function you said was control.
Yes, and this speaks directly to that wider IMF crisis. Think about Kim's life in 1998. It was spinning completely out of his control.
He was powerless against these huge economic forces.
Totally powerless. So this ritual with the tape, it's this desperate, almost compulsive act of exerting absolute rigid physical control over something.
Or someone.
He takes this messy, painful, chaotic human relationship and he tidies it up. He contains it. He wraps it up into this static, silent, manageable object that can't hurt him or humiliate him anymore.
The tightness of the wrapping is like a physical manifestation of his need for order in a chaotic world.
Perfectly put. But then, after all this ritual and chaos, comes the one action that complicates the entire psychological picture.
The arson.
The arson. This is the critical contradiction. At 3:50 a.m., after this exhaustive wrapping ritual, he sets a fire in the shop.
Why?
To destroy the evidence. This act isn't ritualistic. It isn't delusional. It is a cold, calculated, rational attempt to conceal a crime and get away with it.
Right. And even though the fire didn't completely destroy the scene?
The intent is what matters. The intent was crystal clear.
Yeah.
Evade capture. And that rational, organized act is in direct conflict with his later defense.
His defense that he was lost in a fantasy, that he was filming a movie.
Exactly. If you're truly lost in a delusion, why do you feel the need to burn the movie set down to hide a crime you don't even believe is real?
That discrepancy.
That discrepancy became the absolute linchpin of the prosecution's entire case. The ritual suggests a fractured mind, but the fire suggests a criminal one.
So the case goes to court, and it becomes this huge legal and psychological battleground. And it all centers on Mr. Kim's defense.
The introduction of the persona he called Shadow, or Sure Do.
He claimed he had dissociative identity disorder, DID-BOW.
What used to be called multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
He argued that he, Mr. Kim, wasn't the one responsible for the murder.
It was Shadow.
It was Shadow. He claimed this distinct personality took executive control of his body, committed the act, and did the wrapping. And crucially, he insisted that Shadow didn't see it as a murder.
Right, this is the movie scenario part.
Exactly. Shadow believed the whole thing was a film production, that the violence was just special effects. It's a narrative that ties back perfectly to the video store setting.
And the details he gave about this alter ego were pretty out there. He wasn't just another personality.
No. The age he gave for Shadow, 120 years old, is really significant from a psychological perspective.
Why?
By making Shadow ancient, he was placing this alter ego outside of modern society, outside of its rules, its laws, its morality.
So Shadow didn't have to play by the same rules as everyone else.
Precisely. It framed Shadow as this powerful, almost demonic or sage-like figure. And the function of that is to absolve the young, broke, humiliated Mr. Kim of all responsibility.
The blame gets shifted to this ancient, powerful being. It's the ultimate attempt to reclaim some kind of authority in a life where he had none.
Right. But if you look closer, the movie filming claim, as intricate as it sounds, often looks like a post hoc rationalization. It's the perfect alibi.
I wasn't committing a crime, I was making art.
Exactly. But again, if you were so convinced you were filming a movie, why would you then methodically try to destroy the film, the set, the evidence with a fire?
It's that selective nature of the dissociation that's so hard to believe.
And that was the prosecution's main argument. Critics, like the famous profiler Dr. Pyo Chang-won, pointed out how incredibly convenient it all was.
He dissociates for the messy, violent part.
But then snaps right back to reality to plan and execute the arson, a highly rational act of self-preservation.
It suggests he knew exactly what he'd done and understood the consequences.
It does. The arson is the smoking gun of rationality, suggesting that if there was a delusion, it was applied very, very selectively. It points towards conscious manipulation.
So the court is left with this impossible choice. Is this a genuinely fractured mind, broken by the unbearable stress of the times? Or is this a calculated liar, a malingerer, trying to escape the death penalty?
That was the entire debate. And you have to weigh the two competing hypotheses, both of which are compelling in their own way.
Okay, so let's walk through them. Hypothesis A, it's genuine DID.
Right. The argument here is that the extreme, suffocating stress of the IMF crisis, the debt, the shame, the loss of identity, could absolutely trigger a dissociative break in someone who was already predisposed.
We know severe trauma is a major cause of DID.
It is. And in that model, Shadow emerges as what's called a protector-persecutor-alter. It's a personality that comes out to handle the rage and assert the power that the core personality, Mr. Kim, just can't.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of psychological sense. But then there's hypothesis B.
Malingering. Calculated deception. And the evidence for this is also strong.
Inventing Shadow gives him a license to kill without any of the guilt.
Which is a classic pattern in psychopathic manipulation. And you also have to consider the pop culture angle.
Living and breathing in a video store in the late 90s.
He was immersed in dark thrillers, horror movies. It's highly plausible that he modeled his defense, the powerful alter, the movie script, on the fiction he was consuming every day. The defense just feels a little too perfectly tailored to his circumstances.
So how did the court handle this? In Korea, the burden of proof from insanity defense is usually very high.
It is. And given the horrific nature of the crime and the organized arson, you'd expect a very harsh sentence. But the outcome was more complex than that.
They didn't go for the death penalty.
No. They avoided the harshest penalties, death or a life sentence in a regular prison. And that's very telling. While the prosecution hammered on the arson as proof of sanity, the court gave a lot of weight to the psychiatric evaluations.
Which detailed his state of mind.
His extreme distress, yes. The verdict they reached was diminished responsibility.
What does that mean exactly?
It means the court acknowledged that while he wasn't completely insane, his capacity to form criminal intent was significantly fractured by extreme psychological duress.
So he was still culpable, but less so.
Exactly. And that led to him being given mandated therapeutic custody. He was sent to the Gwangju Institute of Forensic Psychiatry.
Which is the country's main facility for treating offenders with mental illness.
Right. So that decision shows that the legal system, in the end, couldn't just dismiss the idea that the unprecedented national trauma of the IMF crisis had genuinely played a role in breaking this man's mind.
Even if parts of his story, like the arson, looked completely rational.
It forced the courts to take these models of partial responsibility much more seriously. The case really highlights how difficult it is to separate genuine stress-induced psychosis from sophisticated deception, especially when a whole country is going through a collective trauma.
Okay, so we've got the context, the crime, the legal battle. Let's pull back and synthesize all this. What did the mummy tape mystery really symbolize about South Korea in 1998?
I think you have to start with the mummy itself as this potent symbol of economic silencing. The ritual wasn't random. It was directly tied to the core trauma of debt and shame.
Right. His life was being ruined by debt.
And Mr. Sun, the creditor, was the literal voice of that debt, that humiliation. So by wrapping him in tape, especially over the mouth, Kim was performing this desperate physical act of silencing.
Sealing away the source of his shame.
It's the ultimate act of containment. He took this loud, demanding, painful reality and turned it into a silent, static object.
It's that idea of tidying up again.
Absolutely. The outside world was pure chaos. Soaring interest rates, mass layoffs. He was totally powerless. The mummy ritual was his one act of obsessive hyper-control. He took a messy human failure and converted it into a perfect, static, manageable thing.
The mummy becomes this monument to the rupture of trust and stability that defined that whole era.
I think that's exactly what it is.
Okay, let's move to the second big insight. The gamification of violence, this idea that the video store environment itself played a role.
For sure. That video store was his psychological bunker. I like to think of it as a kind of pre-digital metaverse.
A space where reality is secondary to the fiction on the shelves.
Right. For a young guy like Kim, already isolated and under this incredible stress, that constant immersion in fictional worlds offered a really dangerous psychological escape route.
And his claim that he was filming?
That's an attempt at profound derealization. It's a way for him to dissociate from his own painful identity, the loser-debtor, and cast himself in a much more powerful, grandiose role.
As an ancient spirit or a movie director.
Whatever it took to not be him. The only way he could process what he was doing was to frame it as not real, as just part of a dark script. And the video shop environment is what allowed that line between fiction and reality to just completely dissolve.
And finally, let's talk about the impact this case had on Korean criminology. It seems like it really forced a reevaluation of how killers are profiled.
It really did. Before this, a lot of the models were fairly rigid, often borrowed from early FBI profiling. You had the organized killer.
Intelligent, plans the crime, socially competent.
And the disorganized killer, spontaneous, chaotic scene, low intelligence. Mr. Kim just blew that binary apart. He was a textbook example of what we now call the mixed offender.
How so?
Well, he had all these organized traits. He knew the victim, he was socially capable enough to have that relationship, and he was rational enough to try to cover his tracks with arson.
But the crime scene itself was the definition of chaotic and ritualistic.
Exactly. The time he spent on the wrapping, the bizarre demon possession defense. That's intensely disorganized, personalized, symbolic behavior.
So it forced the legal and forensic systems to be more nuanced.
It had to. The case made it clear that a person's underlying psychopathology, whether it was real DDE or just extreme fragmentation from stress, could provide the style of the crime, the ritual.
The mummy.
Well, a more practical, rational part of the mind could still be driving the method of concealment.
The arson.
Right. The Bucheon case really pushed the system towards more complex psychological evaluations and a greater understanding of partial responsibility, especially in cases where huge societal trauma is clearly a factor.
Which brings us right back to his sentence at the Ganju Institute. The big public safety question has to be, was Shadow just dormant? Could that personality reemerge if he faces new stressors?
That is the enduring fear with violent offenders who have dissociative disorders. If you remove the original trigger, in this case, the unique economic catastrophe of 1998, does the dangerous alter ego go away for good?
And we don't know.
Well, the sources say there's been no public record of any subsequent high-profile crimes linked to Kim. Now, that could mean the treatment at the Institute was effective. Or it could mean that Shadow was truly a situational monster, born out of a specific pressure cooker that thankfully hasn't been replicated with that same intensity since. #OutBatro.
The mummy tape mystery, then, is one of the darkest lenses we have for looking at the psychological toll of the IMF crisis.
It truly is. A crime born of sheer economic despair.
It was this young man's desperate, bizarre, and ultimately horrifying psychological exit from a reality of debt and shame that had just become completely unbearable for him.
Yeah.
And the victim, Mr. Sun, wrapped in the very tools of his own small business, he became this haunting, preserved symbol.
A monument to the collapse of that social promise of stability and security.
A promise that an entire generation had built their lives on.
So what does all this mean for us looking back on it now? I think the Bucheon case is just this grim, potent reminder that big economic crises are never just financial events.
Right, they're human events.
They're profound psychological traumas. The structural adjustments, the mass layoffs, the interest rates, these things fracture individual minds just as easily as they fracture markets.
The video store was supposed to be a place of escape into fiction.
And instead, it became the final stage for this deeply real horror, where that line between reality and fantasy just dissolved completely.
It really leaves you with a terrifying question.
It does, and it's something for you to mull over. How much of that violence was inherent to the individual, to Mr. Kim himself? And how much was a terrifying, extreme reaction from a person in a society that had suddenly and violently told him he was disposable? That's the hidden psychological cost of financial collapse.